So I've been thinking through this philosophy, metaphysics of conscious evolution, and really thinking about it in terms of really processing it. Maybe if I could do a one sentence elevator pitch or a 10-second. Essentially, metaphysics of conscious evolution is basically the realization that everything is conscious on some level, including human beings, evolving, human beings still evolving. And essentially, it's just a continuous process of a kind of becoming, constantly becoming. And that level of that experiential quality is valuable because you could do some classic philosophical experiments, philosophical thought experiments like Mary's Room, or what it's like to be a bat. So essentially, experience is valuable. And becoming is valuable. And essentially, we don't really know where things are always going. There's a kind of unknown aspect. There might be essentially the infinite playing around in all of these derivative creations, these derivative structures, these derivative states. And this is not just evolution, but it's conscious evolution. There's qualia. There is experience. It's an experiential process. It's something that is alive and intelligent. It's sort of like a halfway point between what we would think of as a pure animalistic, naturalistic sort of natural selection theory. And on the other side, you have like a pure creationist model. Somewhere in the middle, you maintain a sort of intelligence, you maintain a sort of conscious awareness, you maintain participatory, a sort of John Wheeler, it from bit type of mindset. There's a participatory nature. But you don't necessarily need it to be you don't need it to be heavy-handed. It can still be very much a complexity that's allowed to emerge over time. A complexity that's allowed to happen via free will decisions, as Federico Fagin would put it. Free will decisions, consciousness, choice. So these things happen not just over the course of our lifetimes, but the course of maybe millions and maybe billions of lifetimes, and maybe even across multiple universes. We look at quantum physics, and people are very comfortable with talking about many worlds, many, many, many worlds, so many worlds. So this idea of a multiverse is not even crazy anymore. So multiverses and branching, all of this stuff is normal. So essentially, choice and time are normal. And this happens over the course of a lot of time. So really, the human being is not some special, perfect place. It's just a particular place at a particular point in time. and we are still evolving. Who knows what the human being will look like in a million years, 10 million years, 1 billion years? We don't know. Humans might be gone. There might be something else that's conscious, looking back at the universe, coming up with their own conclusions. But ultimately, this conscious evolution allows for all of these things to happen. We don't know where the human project is going to go. We don't know what's going to happen. That's up to us on this particular branch or this particular universe to figure out for ourselves. It's a process of becoming. It's a process of exploration. So I've been rolling around this philosophy for a while now. I really like it. It's a sort of panpsychist philosophy, but in a way, it's a bit on the idealist side as well. But you don't really have to go there. You could relatively stay in a kind of physicalist, experiential kind of structure. We don't really know what it all fundamentally is, but you could use things like integrated information theory to go all the way to the bottom and recognize that experience is there. So I find it to be pretty straightforward. It's not exactly making any enormous claims. It's just simply saying that experience is fundamental. Everything has some tangible, even if it's tiny, amount of experiential quality, which is not exactly a radical thought. And that experiential quality has value. And really, everything is a kind of experiment or a kind of project over just enormous amounts of time. So, nothing crazy. It's just a philosophical underpinning that experience has value over time. And life is weird. Life is strange. That strangeness is allowed because there is no fundamental physical normal. All of the building blocks can become anything. So there's a sort of intrinsic strangeness to life. We look at our humanity as normal. It's not. It's not. It's super weird. It just happens to look the way it does. If there was some species out there that was intelligent as well, just like a human, on some other one of these trillions of galaxies, I'm sure there's lots of stuff out there. It would be like watching that TV show way back in the day. What's it called? Dinosaurs, I think. I think it was called Dinosaurs, where essentially it was like everybody. It was almost like the Cosby Show or Fresh Prince or something, where everybody on the show, it was like a family show, but everybody was a dinosaur. There would be other places in the universe where creatures would be social, intelligent organisms, but they would just not look like us. Their entire social reality would be whatever it is they are. And maybe even their physical environment is very different in how they operate. So, our humanity is not some baseline. It's not the standard. There is no standard. There's no normal. Um, so when I think about it from this perspective, my mind lately I've been going toward this realization that I guess you would have to become a little bit more idealist to go in this direction, but let's just go for it because I'm not opposed to thinking in idealist terms. And I say that because I don't think it's a negative thing to recognize that space-time might not be fundamental, but there might be possibilities that awareness could be deeper than space-time. It sounds very foreign to us at this particular point in our understanding, but I can at least entertain the idea. I don't have to hate it. Um, so basically, I started thinking to myself, what is it that causes us, and by us I mean the unified participatory organisms or beings, essence, awareness to participate? Because clearly, when I look at the testimony of near death experiences, there is a lot of reason to want to be on the quote unquote other side. I mean, it feels amazing. It feels like love. It feels like unconditional love. It feels like unconstrained physics. It feels expansive. It feels like there's less friction. It feels like purpose. It feels like the structure is fluid and able to maintain more information than a human body. All of these things make it feel like there's no reason to not want to do that, to go there. Many people say it feels like home. Feels like home. Um, so when I listen to all of these testimonies, I think to myself, it feels like that is actually the natural state. So I've been asking myself every day, overtly, covertly, what is the incentive on the other side? What's the mechanism which brings awareness into all of these various derivative structures, including humans? What's the impulse? What's the compulsion? What's the desire? And ultimately, I think I sort of begun this whole talk with the reason. It's conscious evolution. It's a process of becoming. It's not knowing. And ultimately, every single one of these little projects, whether it's a human or it's a bird or it's a dinosaur, all of this stuff is essentially a kind of experience. What it's like to be a bat, what it's like to be a whatever. You could know everything about the color red, but until you experience the color red, you don't really know anything. So ultimately, experience has value to the other side. And ultimately, within a model of interconnectedness, essentially there is no loss. There's no loss. So everything could be interacting with itself in some deeper fundamental way. And to us, it would feel like, maybe tragedy has happened, but ultimately nothing is lost. Nothing is created or destroyed. Everything is just kind of remixing. And this process, it explains to me why people will feel like a tragic event has happened, but then as soon as they have experiential properties outside of their human body, they feel a bit detached. They feel like everything is perfectly fine. They remember that it's all okay. They remember that, this time distortion is probably true within a different state of mind outside of a physical, human, construct of recognizing time, it probably does feel like a very short period of time. Maybe you have all of this fear, but then once you pass on, you remember. And it's like, oh, yeah, my kids will be here soon. Oh, yeah, my wife, my husband will be here soon. It's not a big deal. Uh, these things are just known. It's only a problem for us because when we are on this side, as we call it, when we're this deeply immersed into the gradient, on this side of the gradient, this particular flavor, this particular zone of the spectrum, we're very deeply embedded. And we forget all of these things because, well, our humanity doesn't need, it's not like mandatory that our humanity forgets about this. And I'll get to this later. This is where I want to take this topic. It's not like mandatory that we forget, but really, the metaphysics of conscious evolution, it's natural that we forget. It's actually kind of normal because a species, in its process of evolving within a physical substrate, a physical reality, a set of parameters that we call like a physical reality, um, it's normal for a species to go through this process through its conscious evolution. And every now and then probably forget, and it not be a big deal because nothing is lost. Maybe that species will go extinct within a short period of time. Maybe it'll go extinct over a long period of time. Maybe those particular vehicles will be around, or maybe they won't. Or maybe a probably much more rare event would be that that species becomes very intelligent. You could use that term, and actually begin to do some things that are a little bit more intriguing. It brings its own uh, it brings its own set of interesting experiences. So it's not as if the human is fundamental to the universe. Like we treat ourselves as this, like, the we have to discover the universe. If we don't describe it, if we don't do it, then we're the only things that are alive and the only things that are sentient and the entire universe, and all is lost if humans don't figure it out. The universe will be a cold, dark, empty place without us. And we have to rush to figure it out, not only because our lifetimes are short, but we have to figure it out because without us, there's nothing. We're potentially the only thing that's sentient in the universe. People actually take these ideas relatively seriously, that humans are essentially, the universe's best chance to know itself. And in a way, you can probably have that mindset and be, somewhat properly aligned, maybe with a bit more desperation than necessary, but it's not really such a bad thing to have a kind of desire for the universe to know itself through humanity. But it's being done with these kind of assumptions that, to me, it creates a kind of hubris. And I don't think it's true anymore that humanity is the only thing that's sentient. We're the only thing in the universe. You know, blah blah blah. So it's perfectly fine that humanity is not aware of these fundamentals, because that would be infringing upon what could be thought of as a sort of naturalistic evolutionary process within all of these derivative structures, whether we're talking about a derivative universe, a derivative galaxy, a derivative star system, derivative planet, derivative biological species within that particular biome of a planet. There is a sort of endless amount of these derivative structures that need to be allowed to happen. You know, if some fundamental substrate thing was determining everything, then that would all be essentially deterministic, massively deterministic, and there would be, and maybe some people will fight for this idea that everything is predetermined, and I could totally understand why people would fight for that idea. Within a materialistic framework, everything is basically there is no. You take the opposite stance. You say there is no free will. Everything is biologically determined. Um, Everything is a kind of biological robot, and your consciousness is it's an illusion. And there are lots of people who have that stance. It's not actually an uncommon stance to have. It's kind of extreme in its ethical and philosophical implications. So it's super unpalatable for most people, but it's definitely not a, it's essentially the extreme for where the logic goes within a materialist framework, a sort of materialist atheist type of framework. It goes toward basically this kind of biological robot deterministic stance. I don't feel that way anymore. I know the word feeling is not exactly enjoyed by people. I just don't think that the evidence that I'm seeing points toward a dead universe, something that it's just biological robots all the way down. I don't know how all of this works, but I just get the sense that on some fundamental level, this idea of moving toward panpsychism, and then this idea of moving toward essentially a kind of living substrate. To me, it seems like the evidence leans more that way. And of course, somebody will say, well, what kind of evidence are you talking about? You sound crazy. There is no evidence. And then I would say, well, you have to begin to expand. You have to look past your assumptions. And this is when the person says, you're the one who has the burden. You're the one with all of the assumptions. My model has no assumptions. My model is clean, sanitary, appropriate. And then I would have to say, well, you've got to be able to expand your mind. You have to be able to recognize that you cannot put everything into a perfect double-blind placebo-controlled experiment. So you can ignore all of this data, whether it's near-death experiences or Gansfeld experiments or whatever. But to me, the evidence for consciousness having non-local properties, maybe it's quantum consciousness, maybe it's, I don't know, some kind of idealist philosophy. I don't know. I don't know what the answer is. But these type of ideas cannot be ignored forever, because unless you ignore them, these type of ideas, I just don't think they can be ignored forever. Consciousness just gets weird, and we don't want consciousness to get weird. I'd say that people have an aversion to consciousness being non-materialist, consciousness not being something that is easily explained as a neural correlate in the brain. Because once you do that, consciousness is equivalent with awareness, intelligence, sentience. You start to go into very, very uncomfortable terrain. So people will push back and they'll say, get that away from me. I don't want anything to do with that. Keep it away. Keep it away from me. And it's okay for them to feel that way. And they'll usually push back and say, I'm not crazy, you're crazy. I'm not emotional, you're emotional. I'm not lacking the data, you're lacking the data. So it's not a process that's without any kind of there is an emotional fight. There's an emotional battle that has to happen. This process of recognizing potentially that something like a metaphysics of conscious evolution is probable, or maybe even possible, or maybe even likely, there's going to be a fight. There has to be this, as much as everybody wants to say that they are rational and, they're logical and there's no emotion on their part, it's probably not true. It's probably not true. People are going to feel very emotionally connected to their assumptions, even if they have, quote unquote, less assumptions. People are still going to be connected to those ideas. And when data begins to look too strange relative to whatever their philosophical underpinnings, most of the time the response is just to ignore the data. So I do think that we are not biological zombies. I do tend to think that awareness does have a deeper, more fundamental place in all of this. It plays a role that is more important than we've given it credit. It doesn't have to be like the narrative that people were uncomfortable with in the past, where they would say quantum physics is it needs an observer, and the pushback was, if it needs an observer, that's like saying humans needed to be around for the universe to exist. That's not what I'm saying here. I'm saying that on some fundamental level, those observers are perfectly there without any humans. Those participants, that participatory universe is still there when your human body dies. I'm saying the human body is not fundamental. It's still participatory. The feedback loop is still there in whatever capacity. We can acknowledge these capacities or not. The universe still works just fine. The human being is a creature. It's an animal. And it's also a part of conscious evolution. It doesn't necessarily come prepackaged with all of the answers. It's a part of this process of becoming, allowing. It's a process of seeing where the project of existence goes. This is not our home. And that's why I think on the other side, as people move across the spectrum step by step, they say things like that. They say this side of the spectrum feels more like home. And that's that's probably because, calling it, looking at it like a static spectrum is probably not the right way to think about it. It would be more like emanations, something that emanates and something that remains. So you have these emanations, maybe like the ocean, and you have like little tidal waves. And all of these tidal waves, some of them go back into the ocean before others. Maybe sometimes they just dip their feet in, and then they tell all the other waves, hey, I just noticed that there's something that's more present and something that remains. And this human part is probably more like a emanation. So it's not actually something that it might have been around for a long time. We could look back at our human evolution and say, well, this is, humans are billions of years old. Or maybe when we try to think about it as, when were Homo sapiens around, or the Homo class of whatever they call it, genus, or the Homo species, or whatever. They'll say, oh, it's like 10 million years old. So it's definitely been around for a while, but compared to whatever that is underneath, whatever that is deeper down, 10 million years is nothing. It's nothing. It's a blink of an eye. So naturally, people are going to recognize that, okay, that is way more familiar than this. So lately I've been sort of flipping the script. I've been looking at life around me as the hard work. Like, this is actually the hard work. This is actually the place where work is happening. Um, like this is not necessarily where effortlessness is. This is where the work of experiencing all of that qualia, coming with all of those particular constraints, those parameters, is going to be happening. And those constraints, if you go through Buddhism or Vedanta and all them, they're always talking about, well, especially Buddhism, I don't really know exactly, but there's always this concept in Buddhism called suffering. Suffering. It's like when you put all of these constraints together, essentially, you're almost guaranteed basically to experience, a sort of friction within all of these constraints, which you could, pretty closely just call it suffering in a very general sense. So from a Buddhist perspective, they're not ever really trying to stick around. They're not trying to stick around in this. They're like, we're good, man. That's not the fundamental thing. It's just an emanation. So, their whole philosophy is basically talking about connecting identity to the continuity of participating. And this whole thing about realization, self-realization, and you can go down that rabbit hole if you like. It's perfectly available for anybody who wants to go down that way of exploring. but I don't think it, I mean, at this point where I'm at, I don't necessarily think it's mandatory that somebody recognize that life is this this participatory process that needs to be ended. I'm not necessarily there, but I can totally understand that in a very simple way, it could easily be looked at like you put all these constraints together, the more individuation that you are, the more boundaries, the more constraints, the more parameters, the more differentiation, the more that you do, more derivative structures, there's a pretty high likelihood that these constraints are going to create suffering. It's going to create all kinds of ways that all of the stuff that everything is interacting with each other in divergent ways where they are protecting their boundaries. And that process of boundary protection is likely to create what we would call suffering. Now, what's fascinating about thinking in this type of way is recognizing a difference. If a person has a materialist framework where they're going all the way in that direction, then it's very easy for them to look at that as fundamental. That suffering is fundamental. That suffering is what they must fight against and run away from at all costs, because that's all there is. On a fundamental level, that's all that there is. If they lose that game, then they've lost the game of existence. They've lost the game of being. Uh, and I think that part of our humanity is very deep. On a fundamental level, we are evolved within that type of environment. Every creature is protecting its boundaries and fighting for its differentiation in basically the most extreme ways possible. I mean, we're talking extreme violence, basically murder, um, eating each other and uh, you know, destroying one another, essentially. I mean, this is very fundamental to how a species survives over millions of years. There are no fundamental rules. Uh, Everything is basically where when we're this deep in all of these derivative structures, these things are heavily, heavily fighting one another to survive another day. So I completely understand why people, we are just as much a part of the animalistic world as everything else. And it makes a lot of sense to me that this is deep. It is deeply embedded in our animalistic nature. And we are essentially evolving. We're still evolving. Um, we're still ethically conflicted. A lot of people, not everybody, but quite a lot of people are still ethically conflicted that they need to eat other creatures to survive. Whether you call that other creature an animal or some people it's a plant. If there is a more panpsychist nature to everything, then no matter what you do, you're going to be causing harm. And some people are very conflicted about this. There is no free lunch. There's no easy answer. Um, So this process of conscious evolution is it's challenging. This on this side of the spectrum, it's it really is like work. It's like work. Um, and I think it's actually kind of relieving for me to recognize that it's relieving for me to recognize that because it helps me to relax into it. I don't need to fight so hard. I don't need to feel like it's, you know, fighting against me. I don't need to feel like it's me versus the world. It's, you know, it's the big evil suppressor oppression people versus little old me in a world that's against me or something. You know, I don't need to have these narratives anymore. It's already challenging enough on its own. I don't need to feel like it's so fundamental that literally all of existence is against me. It's just it's a challenging set of structures. It's always going to be that way. And that's just kind of the nature of what it is. Um, but it doesn't have to be like fundamentally trying to get me in a way. I don't have to look at it like that. If anything, I don't even really have to identify with it. It just simply is. The human project, if we can call it that, simply is. It's just it's a process of evolution. It's a thing out there. It's one of the things. You know, I give it a fun name, but we could just call it evolution. It's a process of conscious evolution. It's just one of the things in all of the evolutionary process across billions and billions of years, probably across many universes, even. So it's not something that I have to truly identify with as fundamentally ultimate. Um, if I had a more atheist materialist mindset, I probably would feel that way. I probably would feel like this is all there is. And it's against me. You know, it is, this is all there is, and it's all meaningless. And it's a cold, empty universe, and humans are the only thing that are sentient. And the entire system is set up against me. And I have an uphill battle. And that's just the way it is. So that's why I said it's somewhat of a middle ground because I've just gotten to a point now where I look at that set of assumptions, that's that mindset, and you could probably argue that the materialist atheist mindset is it has less assumptions, but I just get the sense that that type of mindset would not entertain certain potentials by its own bias and its own addictions to certain ways of thinking. Um, and it would require a pretty radical shift to be able to imbue the universe with a pretty radical philosophical change. And there's no double blind placebo controlled experiments that are going to do that for you. There's no journal that's going to do that work for you. You have to explore the landscape of teleology, I think is the word. You have to explore the landscape of meaning on your own and carry that same rational rigor with you the best you can. It's something that is going to be a somewhat isolated process because you're going to have to find your own tolerance. You're going to have to find your own meaning. And the world will probably disagree with you. The world will not just find your ideas palatable just because you say them out loud, just because it makes sense in your own head. You might find things in your own mind to be palatable that somebody else finds to be repulsive. And this is why species like humans do better when there is social coherence. When everybody has like a similar mindset, then you could probably find more, social lubrication for productivity, efficiency. And that's why these topics are so challenging because basically we're going against our own biological incentives, our own evolutionary incentives to just listen to what everybody else tells us. When we sort of go off on our own, we are essentially going against what feels right within our biology, and it's painful. So to go back to a bit of high octane speculation from earlier, what is the reason to participate on this side of the spectrum? What's the reason? It seems obvious why it feels good, almost like a gravitational pull, a magnetism to experience a kind of powerful experience with the other side of the spectrum. But what is the reasons to experience this side of the spectrum? What are the reasons? Well, as I stated earlier, I think it goes toward this idea of the value of experience within a living substrate, something that's fundamentally experiential, essentially experiencing itself in many forms, many vantage points. So nothing is lost. So when we think about the risk, we say from this side, why would anybody want to come here? Why would anybody want to come into this? Well, from a different vantage point, there's no risk. It sounds crazy to say that from this particular vantage point because it feels like there's only risk. But the truth is, if you have these emanations, and we all understand that these emanations are coming from what we could think of like an ocean, a substrate, then we also know that those emanations are not separate. They only appear to be separate. And these particular emanations might lead to very interesting experiences. And ultimately, it's not money that's important from that particular vantage point. That's not going to be work. It's not going to be money. It's going to be something valuable to something like that, which probably would be something like experience. Experience would be the only value to acquire, you know, essentially the the entropy increasing for something like that would be a kind of novelty factor, something that's constantly remixing for the purposes of novelty, value acquisition from novelty. So when I think about why, what's the compulsion? From our perspective, the idea is crazy. From our perspective, we have this idea that there's too much risk. It's too painful. It's too, it's just too much suffering. It's endless suffering. But if we change our perspective, there's this realization that the suffering really isn't a big deal, which sounds crazy, but it kind of makes sense. It's weird that it kind of makes sense. The suffering is there's no loss. And what you gain is experience. And there's no normal, there's no standard. So that means you might even gain novel experience, truly novel experience. There's no limit to how universes can evolve. They call it the anthropic principle that there's who knows how many dead universes that formed, and this is the only one. And we're talking and explaining in this one because it's the only one that had all the correct parameters. But the idea is that there are many, many different structures of universes out there that didn't quite look like ours. There's no reason that we should have gotten the perfect universe the very first time with all these fine tuned parameters. So there's probably who knows how many millions or billions of universes out there that don't have any life in it. That's the idea. So once again, bringing up this concept that there are probably many, many, many structures out there that have different parameters. There is no normal. Everything is, humans are not the only kind of life and the only kind of structured awareness as a particular biological filter for the structure of awareness within a particular biological derivative environment. This is just one, probably of billions, and that's being very conservative. If there's only intelligent life, and we're not talking about all of the other life because that's probably even more ubiquitous. But even if we're only talking about intelligent life, you know, life that might be doing some interesting things with equations or something, or mapping out causal relationships. Even if it was just one in, let's say, 100 of these galaxies out there, that would still be something like, let's just call it dozens of billions, dozens, not just dozens, dozens of billions of interesting vantage points to explore. Um, Novel variety to explore. And then, of course, none of these things are static. Humans are still evolving. We're still changing. There's no participatory process which is finished. There's no participatory process which is finished. So, participation, participation, participation continues. The process of experience continues. Maybe from a Buddhist perspective, suffering continues. Um, but if we don't just only focus on this sort of inevitability that parameters will cause friction, which you could call suffering, you could simply say that living continues in all kinds of varieties of form, states, being, novelty. Humanity is just one of those particular states, one of those particular novelties. But something I actually find pretty intriguing lately is this idea of what we could call love. It's a very cliche word, especially within metaphysical type circles and new age circles, spiritual circles. But the idea has gotten interesting to me lately. And I actually think it's worth talking about within the context of these type of conversations. It's so cliche that it makes me cringe a little bit, but I want to bring it up anyway. Let's talk about this concept and why it actually could be thought of in some type of way. Um, so what I think is fascinating about this idea of what we call love is that basically, I kind of think that the entire universe Let's just make big, broad, sweeping statements for fun. Let's just have some fun. I kind of feel like the entire universe is directed toward love. Once again, super strange. What do I mean? I kind of think that this idea of love is inevitable because basically any species that reaches a level where they have the kind of cognition like a human or greater, they are going to recognize the type of things that I'm saying here. They're going to recognize this sort of interconnectedness of all things. And to me, this kind of interconnectedness is a form of love. It's a form of recognizing unity. And even if it takes who knows how many millions of years, hopefully not billions of years, but even if it takes a while, a species will learn. So basically, despite all of the evolutionary violence, despite all of the intensity of all of that differentiation surviving, despite all of the higher level social dynamics and intelligence expressing itself through just a innumerable, innumerous, is that a word? Seemingly infinite, countless amounts of social violence toward one another. Despite all of this stuff, essentially, this interconnectedness, this higher level awareness shines through. It is realized on some level eventually. Because once again, the ocean, using the analogy again of the ocean and the wave, the ocean is the thing that is creating the emanations. The emanations, they can come, they can go over some period of time, which might be a crazy amount of time, but they come, they go. The ocean remains. So essentially, discovering the ocean, maybe a species, a particular project, maybe it doesn't quite make it. Maybe that particular species, that particular project ended up destroying itself. That's fine. You know, it happens. Uh, you know, every parameter is not going to be exactly the same. Every particular trajectory is not going to be exactly the same. That's kind of the point. We don't know where humans are going to go. But what I do think is interesting is that if a species does continue, they're going to recognize, well, they're going to recognize either that I'm completely wrong about all of this, and, you know, they're probably going to be some kind of materialist foundation, materialist atheist type of foundation, and then just, you know, maybe that'll be the truth. But if I'm not completely wrong, and there is this kind of fundamental interconnectedness, there is this fundamental awareness, you could say, then any species that sticks around long enough is going to recognize this kind of interconnectedness. And probably experience it as what we would call, love. But you could probably use less cliche words than love. Like maybe you could call it ecstasy or bliss, euphoria, joy, passion, uh, knowing, deep knowing. These type of things are words that point toward something that's not fundamentally it doesn't have to be so simplified that we take out all of the actual value from the words. So I do think any species that lasts long enough will absolutely recognize these things. They will move toward love. So, in a very interesting way, you could have a foundational reality based in novelty, a kind of like foundational universe based in novelty, uh, a kind of like randomness, you could say, maybe if that's the right word. Um, but a kind of randomness that might be influenced by what we would call conscious agents or awareness or intelligence. Who knows? Who knows what the right word is? But you could have like a fundamental substrate that's based in novelty that expresses itself in evolutionary dynamics, which are massively intense from, massively intense from a existential violence perspective, suffering, philosophical suffering, realized suffering, this type of stuff. And yet somehow, simultaneously, everything actually being magnetically pulled toward love. Because essentially, any species that survives long enough is basically going to recognize a kind of fundamental interconnectedness. They're going to reunify with that very same ocean. Because essentially, it's like learning about gravity or it's like learning about electromagnetism, like recognizing this kind of non-local consciousness substrate thing is like learning about electromagnetism or learning about gravity. It might not be the most accessible thing at first, like mapping out your local gravity so that you can understand like fall damage is probably more important than mapping out like the landscape of consciousness, at least at first. you know, clearly that seems to make a lot of sense to me. But ultimately, it does seem like something which is inevitable to be explored. It has to be explored. The question of consciousness, awareness, qualia, these type of questions, these philosophical metaphysics need to be explored and recognized eventually. And those type of questions have downstream implications. So I think it's fascinating that you could have a sort of like idealist framework that operates in an evolutionary dynamic with all of that violence and suffering and intensity and pain, yet somehow actually being magnetically drawn toward what we could call the infinite interconnectedness, love, bliss, euphoria, and but it's now doing it from the inside looking out. That's what's fascinating about it. It's taking this evolutionary process and it's knowing itself from within. So it's experiencing the ocean, but now it's doing it as a drop. It's experiencing it from a differentiated perspective of one of the drops within the ocean. It's like one of the tidal waves, one of the waves as it emerges. It's sort of recognizing that it's always connected. It's still connected to the ocean, despite the fact that it feels like its own unique, differentiated wave. And this process is like the wave recognizing the nature of its own being, being the entire ocean, while somehow it's still a wave. Now, of course, this is not something that happens at the pace of a wave. A wave can rise and crash in like a second, but this process could take millions of years, billions of years. Who knows? The point is that to me, it feels somewhat inevitable. If the theory holds true that what I'm talking about is not completely crazy, it's kind of like a magnet. It's like, and that's why I kind of think this idea about aliens being these like galactic conquerors is very naive. I've had some conversations with people, and we always come to this conclusion that aliens who are truly intelligent would be much more like galactic zoologists rather than galactic conquerors. Because at a certain point, that's ultimately what we do as well. We go around we go around our planet, and we, if you're actually doing it right, you're out there treating animal life with respect. You're not trying to intervene as well. So you're not out there trying to like save everything. Maybe every now and then you might do a little something, a little discreet. So it wouldn't totally shock me that humans have had interactions with other intelligent species, but not as a totality, not as a collective. Because most of the time, as a zoologist or like some person who's out there interacting with other animals, you're not trying to heavy-handedly control nature. You're just kind of like letting nature do its thing. So in a way, you're not even trying to control this idea of suffering, because it's natural. And in a way, you have to let it play out. But I think as you become more intelligent, it really does begin to feel kind of like that whole prime directive thing, do not interfere, whatever it was. non-interference policy stuff, because ultimately there's no purpose to go around blowing everything up. What's the point? You know, what's the point of that? And once you reach a certain level of advancement, you don't even need to harvest resources like the way you used to. You could probably build self-sustaining um, craft, ships, whatever, motherships, whatever, relatively self-sustaining. So you really wouldn't need to like go around harvesting and stuff all the time. You know, nobody's gonna go on some intergalactic trip if they can't. For one, they have to be able to travel through space time faster than the speed of light, which is already something that most people consider nearly impossible. And number two, you're not going to go on that kind of trip if you have to like harvest asteroids or something. You know, that just seems kind of stupid. So basically, you're not really going to take that kind of a trip as a intelligent species unless you really don't need the resources of other beings, other organisms, other planets. You probably need to be more self-sustainable. So I do get this feeling like any truly intelligent species out there is going to look more like a zoologist than some kind of conqueror. The whole conquering thing is more of a reflection of our own um, lower level consciousness. We haven't really woken up yet to, and that's fine. You know, humans, the human project is still young. It's still like a young project, young species. It's okay that we're not like perfect. We're not perfect. We got a lot to learn. Still have a lot to experience. So I think this generally summarizes what I have been going for. Uh, and yeah, it is a set of philosophical ideas. I don't, you know, a person could reject everything I just said. Um, and, you know, prefer to use a model which doesn't have as much personal interpretation. You know, you could just reject everything and pretty much have a purely, you know, everything, every idea that is ingested has to be from, you know, some academic journals. It has to be double blind, placebo controlled, whatever. Um, that's okay. I don't think that that makes a person wrong for wanting that. Um, or I should say, I don't think that makes a person's emotions wrong. I don't necessarily think that reality can be put into some double blind placebo controlled way. I do think that there is probably certain limits of science, uh, and that's probably going to only become more and more clear over time. We're going to have to go in directions that are more courageous in terms of philosophical underpinnings. Um, and we're going to have to entertain ideas that don't necessarily have perfectly precise uh, models. We're going to have to begin to take in information that does not have perfect precision. And it's going to probably make us uncomfortable because in a universe where it's more subjective, it's more experiential, essentially, we're bringing subjectivity into the fundamental layers of reality, qualia. And when we do that, how do you include that into your equation? How do you include that subjectivity into the equation? How do you include that type of information, which clearly within this model, it would have value, it would have impact, it would have informational density. Maybe someday, eventually, humans will figure out how to tap into it, how to map it out, how to discover it and put it into an equation. Maybe. I'm not sure if that's true, but that's the idea, at least. But also, it's possible that people will figure out that it's probable, that it's likely, that experience really does go much deeper than we think. And we'll figure out that it's more probable that that's the case than improbable much earlier, before we have some perfect equation to, some perfect technology to be able to map it all out in some informationally precise way where we can figure out exactly how that information is stored, how that information impacts the surrounding environment. All I'm saying is things are weird. Things are weird, and reality is going to have elements in it that might be probable, not just plausible, but probable. And we're not going to have some perfect precision. And it's going to make people really uncomfortable. And I don't think that that reason alone is enough to pretend like everything that I just said is completely pointless, or whatever anybody else could discover, rationalize, think through is somehow completely pointless because we don't have some kind of model within our material world to perfectly map everything. I think that that's also going to be the wrong interpretation. Even though it does make sense that that's what we would want. It's what we would want, but I don't necessarily think it's going to happen. At least not. It's going to be easier for us to recognize the nature of things is different than we assumed, than to actually derive all of the mathematics of how this whole thing is working. And we know that to be true because we've had phenomena that are still unexplained. How do you have veridical near-death experiences and near-death experiences that have veridical information? You can explain a near-death experience as a hallucination if there's no veridical, there's no verifiable information. But near-death experiences are that have information the person should not have known continue to happen and will continue to happen. Because if it's a natural phenomena, it will just continue to happen. We don't have a model for how that actually operates. We have no idea. So most of the time, we just ignore it. As a species, we just ignore it. People individually do not, but as a collective, we do. And it's easier to have a atheist materialist model than to try to figure out the mathematics of this crazy veridical near-death experience thing. It's easier just to ignore it. So people are going to lean in, they're going to lean toward it long before we have any kind of mathematical models for it, any kind of real understanding of it, because it is real. It happens. It's a phenomena. It is a part of the structure of this, the world and its emanations, whether we like it or not. But humanity and maybe even science might never have a way to perfectly model it, to perfectly map it out. So do we call it science because we ignore it? Is that what we call science? Do we call it science because we might never be able to map it out? Is that what we call science? If we cannot map it out and we ignore it, is that what we call science? That to me is a very interesting conversation because it brings to the table this idea that there are certain assumptions that science as we know it, the scientific method, is a perfect instrument. And the truth actually might not be the case. It might not actually be adequate. And to me, that's been a big realization for me. So I find that to be fascinating. But ultimately, I think where this gives me the most value is that I operate in my daily life differently. I walk around and I look at people around me in a unified way. I look at the people around me like we are emanations from something much deeper. We are gravitationally pulled toward interconnectedness, love, bliss, whatever word you want to use, but we're doing it in human form. It might take us another million years, who knows? Maybe another 100,000 years, whatever. But if we survive, we're probably going to recognize we're more connected than we are disconnected. We're more alike than we are different. And when I walk around, I just simply look at this part of the spectrum. I look at life like it is a experience of all of this uniqueness, novelty. And it just so happens to all of the randomness looks like this, what I see before me. And I look at all this people around me. I look at all the pain. I look at all the suffering. I look at it all. And I just recognize that it's not fundamental. It's not actually primary. It's not actually the most important thing in the universe. What's happening around me, it might seem that way because our animalistic survival dynamic treats it that way. There's a part of us where all of the alarms are they're all blaring at maximum volume, and it makes sense that any particular animal derived within all of those derivative structures would naturally have these type of animalistic fear-based drives going insane. But there's a part of me that recognizes that there's so much more going on, and I don't have to be afraid. I don't have to be, you know, maybe I could be upset in one way or another because life is not I didn't I don't have like trillions of dollars or something. I don't have all of this accumulations in the most sociopathic way possible. I didn't control every variable perfectly. A lot of this stuff has to do with luck, not just what a person does, but we don't internalize the randomness. We just say, I'm the person who succeeded because I'm so smart, or I'm the person who failed because I'm so dumb. But, we take it personally either way. But when I look around, I see all of these narratives, I see all of these stories, I see all of this pain, I see the evolutionary process, I see all of the time, I see it all, and a part of me just simply empathizes with all of it. That it's not actually, it's more important for us to just be present rather than trying to run away or escape somewhere. It's more important for us to be able to appreciate just how the sun, the feeling of the sun on our skin. It's more important to have gratitude for something as simple as that than try to do any kind of like sociopathic harm to another human. It's more important for us to know the value of what we are intrinsically. You don't have to go out and earn what is already intrinsically valuable. It's more important to do that than to have self-hatred every single day, every single moment of every single day. To have a default state of hatred, self-hatred, projected hatred because of whatever social narratives people have told each other for whatever period of time. The process of a species moving toward love, once again, super cliche. It feels cringy, but I'm just going to keep saying it because it is It's super cliche to talk about, but there are so many experiences within a particular branch of an evolutionary pathway. There's so many experiences that it takes for a species to move toward love, to move toward interconnectedness. There's so much happening within a species that it has to essentially overcome for it to move into deeper and deeper layers of love, so that when it truly reaches a kind of union, a kind of realization of these interconnectedness, it's so deep that it probably does have epigenetic pathways, something like that, over who knows how many thousands or even tens of thousands of years. I mean, it's, evolution is not static. So this process probably is so deeply intense. And once again, these projects, like, colloquially calling it the human project, this is not like a static thing. It's happening over so much time that this is a process that plays out over a long period of time. This is not something that we have to simplify down to an extremely generic story. So, maybe a person experiences a human life where the only thing they do is just move through the world and play music for people. And that's what they do with their life. Some people would say, well, that's not scientific. That's not, they're not being extremely productive or something. They might say something like that. But the truth is that time, time is fascinating. You know, these projects, these experiences, they do not have to happen instantaneously. Evolution is long. It is a long, long process. And the value of a life, if you want to go into ideas about the continuity of a particular identity or some kind of causal interconnectedness, some kind of interdependency. Maybe some people colloquially call that a soul. But if you really want to talk about some kind of causal interdependency, then we're probably gonna have to talk about how a life is lived. And if a species is drawn toward love over a long period of time, then these interdependencies are going to fluctuate. Sometimes they're lived in a way where they are going against the grain, and sometimes a life is lived where it's essentially going toward the grain or going with the grain. And ultimately, there's no wrong answer. It's just experience and course correction. And that's ultimately what lets these experiments play all the way out. These experiments are going to happen. Participatory universe. There's no eternal damnation. These type of ideas. At least that's not what it seems. Pretty much all of the evidence I found. All of the people who went into the death process with those type of ideas, in general, realized that they were not correct. And to me, it doesn't make any sense anyway. All of this makes more sense to me as a kind of participatory process, a kind of experiment, a kind of project. There's no guarantee where it's going to go. So the participatory nature of it allows for whatever, this or that to play out over time. And it's also okay if the experiment does not go in some predictable way. It's okay. This particular branch, maybe this isn't the way it's supposed to go. But I think ultimately what keeps it all together is that the substrate generates all of these various derivative emanations, and also simultaneously, all of these emanations are eventually drawn toward love, which is essentially back toward the infinite substrate, the living substrate. So I can ramble for like 2 hours, but ultimately this whole idea is based in very simple ideas. Basically, a kind of panpsychism in a way. Experience is fundamental. It's basically all the way down. Experiential subjectivity. Uh, Maybe a kind of idealist model in a way. Space-time is not necessarily fundamental, but awareness might be. And basically, the evolutionary process as a method for experimentation. The evolutionary process as a tool within derivative universes. You know, whenever I say the word universes or multiverse, it seems crazy, but basically everybody in physics believes in multiple universes, whether you're talking about the anthropic principle or you're talking about the many worlds theory with quantum physics. It's extremely normal to talk about many universes. So I don't think that this idea is that crazy. Essentially talking about a kind of unification. You solve any particular binding problems through a kind of unified substrate, a kind of ocean. And basically, you just declare that it's probably experiential. It's probably some kind of panpsychist model. And basically, what we are seeing on this side of the spectrum are particular emanations. And those emanations are experiencing all of these variety of derivative qualia related to the evolutionary pathways that we've taken. So the process of quote unquote waking up within those derivative substrates, those derivative structures, whether it's a galaxy, a star, a planet, whatever, the process of a particular biology waking up within all of that is it's a very unique thing. It's very interesting. It's very strange. It's very weird, even because there is no normal. I don't think any of this is really that crazy. It's actually kind of normal. It actually gives like a relatively straightforward explanation for a kind of teleology of all of this randomness and potentially an experiential quality to all of it. Without needing to go deeply into any kind of singular theology, you can maintain a sort of unconditional love. You can maintain interconnectedness. You can maintain the reason for all of it, which could be some type of novelty. Maybe the entropy of everything is kind of like infinite novelty. of some kind of deeper experiential nature, some kind of randomness, remixing, a kind of endless remixing, which means as a human being, we don't necessarily need to go anywhere. We don't really need to find our value somewhere else. We are literally intrinsically a part of the value of existence. But I think I'm kind of repeating myself at this point. I'm trying to simplify it to just say I don't necessarily think that all of the stuff I've said makes no sense. I think it actually does have some consistency. It talks about certain, I don't know what the right word is, postulates or axioms or something like that in a very straightforward way. Um, and I think it's fascinating. I really do enjoy recognizing these potentials around me, that the philosophical assumptions and how we approach data that does not fit is fascinating to me.